Πάντα ευγενικός.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at the Greek Economic Summit 2022. I'm Chryssos Kavounides. I'm a managing director and partner at Boston Consulting Group and head of our activities here in Athens. Climate change is the biggest single challenge facing humanity today, and action on climate is possibly the largest, most ambitious change program ever undertaken. In terms of the ambition of the objectives, of the targets, in terms of the degree of collaboration and coordination across geographies, amongst other, but also amongst sectors, the extent of financing required, but even as we were just listening in the previous panel, the technological solutioning which still remains to be done, and the number of technologies need to be scaled up to help us on this journey. COP26 was seen as a major milestone in Glasgow, to a large extent exceeding expectations in many dimensions, but a lot has changed in the world since then. So just a few weeks after COP27 was hosted in Egypt, we want to look back, we want to understand where we are on this journey, consider the challenges we face, but also the opportunities that open up, both globally, but also for us here in Greece more specifically. So with me for this discussion today, Mr. George Kremlis, AmChamGR Circular Economy Committee Chair and Honorary Director at the European Commission, Ms. Kiara Konti, EY Greece Partner, and she leads the sustainability services for Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe and Central Asia, and here in Greece as well. And Michel Fredeau, Managing Director, Senior Partner at BCG, and Global Leader of our Climate and Environment topic, just arrived from Sharm and COP27. So we'll jump right in, and I'll start, Michel, from you. We've heard a lot through COP27 about moving from pledges to implementation. We've seen a lot of countries, a lot of companies making commitments, increasingly so. But where are we in this call for action to move to implementation? And in that respect, what was the feeling of COP27 versus COP26, also in the context of a much changed world?
Yes, the context and the geopolitical context clearly did not help climate negotiation, but still, COP26 in Glasgow was a COP from the north. It was about mitigation, about keeping the 1.5 degree alive, as the UK government put it, and there has been a lot of pledges, and what was the highlight of COP26 as far as I'm concerned was the mobilizations of corporates. A lot of companies were there making pledges and engaging in the climate journey in a very serious way. COP27 was completely different. This is the COP from the south. This is Africa speaking. Africa just represents 3% of the emissions, but suffer from the climate event in a big way. So the COP was much more talking about adaptation, economical development in a just transition context, and of course, loss and damage and finance. And the fact of trying to avoid getting more pledges and more getting to action and implementation. So what happened during the COP, in a nutshell, the big success that you all heard about was for the first time, the world agreed on discussing the loss and damage and developing a financial facility. So it's just agreed on the principle of discussing. There was no money yet. But at least it's the first step of the journey. There has been an agreement on the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation plan, mainly by non-state actors to feed those adaptation plans in the different countries. A lot was discussed about agriculture, and related to agriculture, of course, water and biodiversity. So the full-fledged of the environmental dimensions were put at the same level as CO2. It's not just about CO2. In terms of results, the just transition plans and platforms that started with South Africa last year extended to Indonesia, that got 20 billion support, and will enlarge to Vietnam and India, hopefully, and maybe Senegal in the next year. There has been a number of regional fora around the world to develop projects, and on these projects to help them finance. So it was more than $400 billion of projects that were identified in the different regions, and a strong commitment to advance on that. And as you've seen, the UN has straightened the zero tolerance for greenwashing, with a very important element from the expert group of clarification of what net zero should stand for, and in particular the integrity of carbon credits, of course, but also what is expected in terms of commitment and transition plans. So finance was on the agenda as well, with an agreement to discuss in particular on public finance the role of the World Bank, the IMF, and the multi-development plans. So you see that the part of the discussions were quite wide. It's also important to discuss what's going to happen next. But I think the finance element is a critical one, but also the net zero definition and the use of carbon credit and the natural-based solutions were also an important element, and some funding was agreed to put in there.
Thank you, Michel. George, if I can turn to you. We hear a lot about financing, a lot more sophisticated discussions, becoming more concrete, at least in terms of the intention, both in terms of commitments, in terms of specific sectors, in terms of loss and damage and adaptation. But we also heard some stunning statements, if I recall, from Maria Kozlowski of the Rockefeller Foundation, that of the dollars committed, only 16% have actually been really mobilized. Quite shocking percentages. What do we really need to do to get this properly flowing, to create the transparency? I mean, we heard about greenwashing, to really mobilize this funding and make it effective and impactful.
Thank you very much, Chryssos. The funding issue was the major issue of COP27 and COP26 as well, with the Glasgow Pact and the NDCs that had to be implemented. Of course, COP27 has achieved a major political milestone in the sense that the loss and damage fund was politically agreed. It will have to be implemented, so it is on paper. It will be implemented during COP28 in Dubai, in the same continent where COP27 took place. And of course, meanwhile, a transition committee is established to identify the needs, the scope, the donors, the various milestones, and of course the pledges from the private sector, because the private sector needs to be involved in this huge exercise. For the time being, the major donor up to now is the European Union, and we are proud about this, but this is not enough. This is an international mobilization, and this adds to the commitment which has been undertaken to provide $100 billion from 2020 to 2025 on a yearly basis to support the vulnerable countries in terms of mitigation and adaptation action. Out of this, the European Union has covered 1/4, but still, on the reference that you have made, that a substantial uncovered amount remains, is there. And the question is, will this $100 billion between 20 and 25 become part of the fund, the loss and damage fund, or they are additional amounts. Ideally, for me, they should be additional amounts. The fund is another story. These are old commitments that need to be implemented, but have not been fully implemented up to now. And the important question for the loss and damage fund is whether the fund will cover retrospectively damages, because the scope is broad, it's loss and damage. So will it cover retrospectively all the damages that, for example, Somalia or Pakistan, and we know that they have been huge and have led to climate migration, or it will be, as the lawyers say, ex nunc, from now, and not ex tunc, covering retrospectively the past. So there are extremely important issues, and for me, what is extremely important also is the pledges from the private sector, because there are extremely important multinationals worldwide, which, if they provide a small percentage of their profits, they could contribute substantially to the fund, but also directly to the just energy transition plans, which have started. Michel has referred to them. We have the first one with South Africa, 8.5 billion, not enough, but a substantial amount. We have the others with Indonesia. There have been other agreements. The European Union has also committed to provide an amount of 1 billion to Africa following COP27. But the amounts needed for mitigation and adaptation amount to trillions. And therefore, the billions that are foreseen up to now will not be sufficient to ensure mitigation and resilience.
So two different problems. It's not enough to start with, and how do we actually mobilize what's been committed already effectively, secondly? Kiara, Michel also mentioned transparency and reliability, credibility issues, greenwashing, and so on. As we look forward and we talk about climate-related disclosures by businesses, we're seeing the whole ESG push with banks, etc. How is this going to come and help those expectations on better transparency, better clarity, more clear regulation, which maybe is also a lever to help release some funds with more confidence from the private sector, potentially?
Thank you, Chryssos. One more comment adding to how we finance the transition, if you wish, not just from the donor side, but also from financial institutions. So what we're seeing in Europe particularly, and it links to your question as well, is the push from the European Central Bank towards financial institutions on how to integrate climate and other environmental risks into their entire business, in essence. So from risk, governance, strategy, disclosures. And this is very important for two reasons. One is how the banking sector transforms through this process, but also what this means for corporates, what this means for integrating ESG criteria in loan origination, what this means for their assessment, and how this links back to disclosures and transparency, because missing data is the #1 problem we're having. So what we used to do, like the past 20 years, around climate disclosures and ESG disclosures at large, was working around voluntary type of framework guidelines who were not the same. They were not promoting, let's say, consistency or an easy way to compare the disclosures. So hopefully the new convergence that we're having now, which is phenomenal if you ask someone who has been disclosing for more than 20 years, is actually two big things that are happening. So we have on the international front, the IFRS, who is working on specific international standards for sustainability reporting disclosures. In essence, every pre-existent type of framework or guideline has gone under there. So the old names, let's say, around climate disclosures, for example. And the same exact thing we have in Europe under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, under the EFRAG, the European Sustainability Standards. So hopefully this convergence, which was missing to a very large extent, will resolve many challenges that we used to have. Now, is convergence enough? The answer is no, obviously, but it's a step that we were missing so far. So I would say that the basic problem we have with standardization, transparency, and how actually disclosures bring about the change that's needed, specifically around decarbonization, is to change the approach between a bottom-up view, so we have someone preparing disclosures, submitting or publishing a report, and a top-down view, so bringing commitment to the actual level of disclosure and monitoring progress through disclosures and not just a tick-the-box exercise is what we're more or less missing. So we're seeing a lot of data from global surveys, so specifically around climate, but also across chief sustainability officers across the globe, that most of them, like more than 90%, have commitments on decarbonization. But the actual disclosures about these commitments, or the actual performance, more importantly, lacks a lot. So, for example, although almost 90% have this type of net zero commitments, not even 30% of them have specific measurements, KPIs, targets for 2030. So they might have pledged to a 2050 commitment, but what that means for now or for 5 years from now is lacking. So to summarize, I think definitely disclosures and the convergence around the standards, particularly climate-related disclosures, is extremely helpful. It's also extremely helpful that we see those big organizations that are publishing these standards to focus on climate scenario modeling, which was missing and still is missing from decarbonization strategies. You cannot have a decarbonization strategy without stress testing how you will move under different climate scenarios. So this is now mandatory, which is a very big step. Let's say the objective is definitely to by improving disclosures, to actually improve performance and reaching decarbonization targets.
So the banking system basically has a very central role to play, because it's being leveraged in a way, first of all, to deploy public funds through the banking system, but also to incentivize and direct, in a way, a lot of the financing to drive in the right direction from a climate perspective.
Support transition, in essence.
George, you mentioned a lot about public but also private financing, and we understand, we're working towards trying to create a cyclical economy, green economy, etc. What role does, in the context of what we just heard as well, what is the role of sustainable finance in that kind of environment?
Green financing is nowadays what needs to be developed, and it is institutionalized thanks to the taxonomy regulation of the European Union, which has a broader scope, as the EIB, the EBRD, and other international financial institutions, as well as national banks, have endorsed not exactly all the principles of the EU taxonomy, but the key idea is that any financing from now on should assess the environmental, climate, and energy footprint of the project, which is financially supported. And this is extremely important because the EU taxonomy, for example, which is the pioneering model that we promote also worldwide, has a lot of environmental priorities, and amongst them, circular economy, which for me is the overarching priority, as we need to implement this new economic model as the emblematic model which will enable us to save our planet and not face the consequences of the linear economy, which would be, if continued, to have 2 or 3 planets in 2040 or 2050 required to meet the needs of this generation and of the future generations. Therefore, this is also connected with the taxonomy of the banking sector, because Kiara has developed on that, and you have asked the question, because the banks also are bound to apply on their own the taxonomy criteria vis-à-vis their clients, and also the companies under the ESG criteria need to develop projects but also become ESG to attract more easily green financing. So we are in a cycle which is under the umbrella of circular economy and which promotes the green financing with the idea to reduce the environmental, the climate, and the energy footprint.
A bit of a provocative question. We're doing a lot of this, and we're talking about the EU taxonomy being more or less a best practice that's being gradually adopted more broadly. It's a bit the elephant in the room. Are we doing enough, though? Europe is taking a stance. It's leading in a way here. Are we doing enough to make sure that we are not putting European business, for example, at a disadvantage? I know something we've discussed with Michel. He has strong opinions about.
The European business are in disadvantage because they have more difficult access to green financing, because financing nowadays is green and has to be green, whereas other partners in the world have access to financing, which is not necessarily green. They are not bound by taxonomy rules, although we are promoting this practice, and wherever there is aid or neighborhood policy initiatives or initiatives vis-à-vis the candidate countries, these are rules that have to be implemented. But again, they are not yet global. And moreover, the other international partners are not bound by state aid rules. So they can support their industries, they can promote more easily eco-innovation, hydrogen, whereas in the European Union, all this has to be done under green tenders with the taxonomy criteria and with strong environmental and climate assessments, because any project financed from now on has to undergo a full climate proofing to show that the project will be climate resilient, but also the operation of the project will be mitigated in terms of impacts that it will have on the environment.
So these
the price to pay.
So the spirit of collaboration at a global level, agreements that are reached at milestones like the COPs are super critical in order to make sure the world is moving at least in a way in the same direction, even if at slightly somewhat different speeds.
Otherwise, we are in unfair competition situations, which are detrimental for the EU because our level of ambition is very high, especially in this period of energy crisis, and somehow we are paying the prices of our high level of ambition, which is noble, of course, and which is in the common interest, but it is not profitable across the board for the European enterprises.
Kiara, coming back to that and the concept around scrutiny and integrity and looking at credits and regulated carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets, how does that play into the picture, and to what extent does that address some of these concerns?
One comment here has to do with what Michel also stressed in the beginning about the main, let's say, discussion or conclusions from COP. It's very important to keep reminding ourselves that climate change is not a standalone issue. It's a systemic issue that needs a systemic approach in that. So coming back to the circular economy comment also, because again, circular economy is just a model that one of their basic principles is how we're not using non-renewable energy sources to feed the economy, and we're not creating any externalities as well. So it's all connected in a way. And coming back to credits, the emphasis is clearly on removal. It's not anymore just on avoiding or reducing emissions. So that's evident from the global community, it's evident from EU, IPCC, and so forth. So given that all these type of initiatives that create carbon credits are either technology-based solution, carbon storage. We had the previous panel was very interesting on that, but also nature-based solutions. What we're seeing in Europe, in essence, is that we're falling behind on that. We're falling behind in two ways. A, because the natural sinks are declining, in essence, so we're not avoiding emissions because of that to the degree that we would want to. And then the big infrastructure technological type of investments are missing at this point in time to avoid the remaining emissions. So when it comes to better quality in credits and better methodologies, truth is that we have made steps since the Kyoto Protocol. We're seeing more qualitative approaches, more accurate approaches. It remains definitely an issue. Double counting remains an issue. And also the basic principles around how the credits are actually issued. So additionality, for example, is a very important principle when we talk about carbon credits, but it's not always the case under some of these projects. So keeping an eye on the basic methodologies, keeping an eye on who issues these methodologies, either NGO or more formal institutions, other formal institutions, the validation behind those credits, and also, very importantly, the role of technology behind carbon credits at large. So, for example, besides any mechanisms for monitoring, there is a lot of information and backup from the global community around the use of blockchain for carbon credits. So this will definitely move into the direction that transparency around credits will increase under a blockchain type of approach. So we're moving to that direction. We're not definitely there yet, but again, it's a work in progress.
Thank you. Michel, back to you. What I'm hearing is we're making progress in many dimensions, but not fast enough, and not fully synchronous across geographies. But we have some fundamental infrastructure there to help us on the way. What should we expect from the next COP, and what do you expect to see being discussed there? How do you expect that to have evolved from where we are today?
So just as a comment, this COP process is always very frustrating because there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of pledges, commitments, and at the end of the day, emissions are growing by 11%. They should be reduced by 45% by the end of the decade if we want to remain well below 2 degrees. We're not. We're going to pass 1.5 degrees probably in the next years. So the situation is quite serious. Having said that, COP28, by mandate of the Paris Agreement, they're going to be the global stocktake. Global stocktake is the formalization of where the world is exactly when you add up all the NDCs. So it's going to do exactly what I've just said, which is questioning whether 1.5 is still alive. This is really serious. And behind that, there's the question of accountability and transparency on how we measure and what do we agree to review every year to make sure that we push the degrees. At the COP27, I attended meetings and discussions about should we release the 1.5 degree constraint. The answer is you don't negotiate with science. Every 0.1 degree matters. You see the climate events all over the planet today, everywhere. So the question is, how you accelerate? So first is the global stocktake that's going to give the picture, but then needs to get into real discussion and real action. One theme that is overwhelming is energy transition. It's going to happen in the UAE. It's an oil and gas country, so oil and gas will be at the center, and energy transition. And energy transition related to what George was saying is if we want emerging markets to be equipped with clean energy, we need to give them access to financing. And access to financing, which is not 15 or 16%, because no project is going to fly. And access to financing is not additional debt. The president of South Africa at the COP27 said after he received this funding from the Just Energy Transition, where there was a real question about how this funding is going to be, done. And he said, if you give us loans, it's useless. We're already completely indebted. We can't. Think about, he said, it's an existential crisis. When it's an existential crisis, what do you do and what do you fund? I mean, there are other means, there are grants, there are other ways for the North countries to help. So there's one around energy transition and the role of oil and gas. Of course, there will be the question on adaptation, because we need to move on adaptation, starting with the 100 billion that we need to deliver. I mean, this is not serious. We all know it's a drop in the water. I mean, it's 100 billion. We need 400 billion at least by the end of the decade, with all the events that are coming up. Because in fact, what is happening, we've got both the cost of action and the cost of inaction together, and we need to pay for them. And therefore, again, this will be discussed. So adaptation, I think, is an important element that will be discussed. And I think that we need to find a way to finance the loss and damage, otherwise there's going to be a loss of credibility. So there's a lot to be discussed, but we need to continue to do that. One element of hope is that there was an agreement of China and the US to come back to the table and to relaunch the working group. I think we need leadership, and if the US and China could help build this leadership, that will help the world. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for the participation, the great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chryssos.
Βγάλουμε και την καθιερωμένη φωτογραφία.